All right, so Lebanon. Things are getting pretty tense over there, and we need to unpack it. You sent over that BBC report about Israel's latest strikes, and what's got me worried is they're hitting central Beirut now. That's not just the outskirts, that's hitting the city directly.
Yeah. No, you're right to focus on that. That is a big deal. It's not very common at all. This is what, only the third time since this thing blew up that Israel's gone straight for the heart of Beirut like this.
So this is a serious escalation then. The report mentioned they were trying to take out this Wafik Safa guy, described him as like a, quote, high-ranking Hezbollah figure. What does that even mean, though? Like, how do we understand high-ranking when we talk about Hezbollah?
Good question, because Hezbollah isn't exactly your typical military with, generals and all that. When they say someone like Safa is high-ranking, it means he's in the inner circle. So he's got real influence, probably talks to the top leaders directly. It's less about a specific rank, more about how much weight his words carry.
Got it. So taking him out would be a big deal, if they actually did. And that's where it gets confusing, right? The report says Hezbollah is claiming he's fine, but then Lebanon's saying 22 people died in the strike, over 100 hurt. It's kind of like, well, which is it?
Yeah, and that's the thing about war. It's messy. Imagine explosions everywhere, buildings collapsing, people running for their lives, communication lines down. Trying to get accurate information in the middle of that's next to impossible. It's too early to tell who's right about Safa, honestly.
Man, it's easy to forget about the human cost when we talk about this stuff. And speaking of what's happening on the ground, the report mentioned that even with these attacks on Hezbollah leaders, Israel's progress in Lebanon seems way slower than in Gaza. What's up with that? What's the difference?
That's a really good point, and it shows how different this situation is. Hezbollah is saying they've already replaced whoever they've lost. They're saying they're still ready to fight, and we've seen this before. Think about Hamas in Gaza. They've been fighting Israel for a year now, and they were still able to launch that counteroffensive, even inflicted casualties.
So even with their leaders targeted, both groups are like, we're not going anywhere. Does that mean this is going to go on longer than people think?
It could. You see, Lebanon isn't Gaza. Hezbollah's been around for decades, they know the terrain, and they are really good at this kind of fighting. Plus, the land itself is much more difficult to fight in. Israel might be moving quicker in Gaza, but that doesn't equal a fast victory in Lebanon. Not at all. This is a marathon, not a sprint.
Okay, so this is already complicated, but then there's the other thing from the report. That Israeli strike that hit the UN peacekeeping base in South Lebanon. 2 peacekeepers injured, and understandably, everyone's freaking out a bit.
Yeah, and they have every right to be worried. Those UN forces, they're the only thing between some semblance of order and total chaos in that region. And if they have to withdraw, which they've hinted at, this whole thing could explode. And you know who always suffers the most? The people stuck in the middle. We saw this in Gaza, remember, when aid workers got targeted and organizations had to flee. Same thing could happen here, maybe even worse.
That is a terrifying thought. Really drives home the stakes of all of this.
It really does. And that brings up another major concern.
The humanitarian situation. We can get caught up in military stuff, but there are real people stuck in the middle of this. What happens to them if aid can't get through?
Honestly, it'd be a disaster. We're talking food, clean water, medicine, all the things people need just to survive day to day. If those supply lines get cut off, or even worse, aid workers get targeted, the whole region could end up in a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
And we've seen what happens when aid groups have to pull out, right? Gaza is a perfect example of that.
Exactly. As soon as aid dries up, it's the most vulnerable. The kids, the elderly, anyone already struggling, they're the ones who bear the brunt of it. That's the harsh reality. It goes way beyond just the fighting itself.
Man, it's a lot to take in. It's like this pressure cooker, and there aren't any easy answers. So zooming out for a second, what are the big takeaways you want our listener to really understand from all of this?
I think the most important one is that things are escalating in Lebanon, and fast. Those strikes on central Beirut, that's a major development. And the fact that Hezbollah is still talking tough even after being hit tells me this isn't ending anytime soon.
And then you've got the whole UN peacekeeper thing on top of it, just adding another layer of danger to an already explosive situation.
Right. They're the glue holding this fragile piece together. If something happens to them, if they can't do their jobs, it could be catastrophic, like pulling the only pin holding back a tidal wave.
It gives me chills just thinking about it. The whole situation feels so precarious, like it could tip over at any moment. It's a lot to process, even with your expert breakdown. What can people like us, people who aren't directly involved, what can we even do with this information? It feels so overwhelming.
Yeah, I get that. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of these global problems. But remember, knowledge is power. Staying informed is the most important thing you can do. If you understand the complexities, the history, the possible outcomes, then you can have more informed discussions. You can push for peaceful solutions. Even if it's just within your own circles, awareness is critical.
You're right. Staying silent doesn't help anyone. We might feel a million miles away, but staying informed lets us engage in meaningful ways. Maybe that's supporting aid organizations on the ground. Maybe it's having thoughtful conversations with friends and family. Or maybe it's just remembering the human cost of what's happening.
Exactly. And that human cost, that's what we can never forget. Behind all the headlines and the politics, there are real people whose lives are being torn apart by this. Families forced to flee, futures uncertain, and so many lives lost.
It's sobering, isn't it? These aren't just abstract geopolitical games. These are deeply personal tragedies for so many people.
You got it. And as we try to understand the immediate impact of this escalation, the biggest question hanging over everything is, where do we go from here? Is there any way to find a quick and lasting resolution? Or are we looking at the beginning of a long and complicated conflict, one that will have ripple effects for Lebanon, Israel, and the entire Middle East? That's what I want everyone to think about moving forward.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the bigger picture. So we've covered a lot of ground here. The strikes, how Hezbollah is pushing back, the risks to those peacekeepers, and that whole humanitarian disaster waiting to happen. It's a lot. Is there anything else we should be looking out for as this develops? Anything in the news that our listeners should be paying close attention to? Something that maybe isn't obvious right away?
That's a good question. I'd say keep an eye on how the rest of the world reacts. I mean, are countries just making statements condemning the violence? Or are we seeing some real diplomatic pressure being put on anyone involved? Because honestly, sometimes that international pressure is the only thing that can prevent things from spiraling even further out of control. Sometimes it's the only thing that can lead to a ceasefire.
Right. It's like that saying, people tend to behave better when they know the world is watching. Okay, that's my takeaway quote for the day, everyone. But seriously, you've given us a lot to think about today. Any final thoughts? Anything that maybe gets missed in all of this? Something important for our listener to really chew on?
You know, with all the fighting and destruction, it's easy to forget that if there's ever going to be a real lasting peace, there have to be people on all sides who are willing to sit down and talk. Even if it seems impossible right now, it's hard to remember that when the bombs are falling and everyone's using such harsh language. But without that dialogue, any kind of resolution is probably just going to be temporary.
That's a really powerful thought to end on. Okay, listener, I know this one was heavy. You wanted a deep dive, and we definitely went deep today. Hopefully, you're coming away with a better understanding of what's happening over there, who the players are, and what's at stake. As always, keep those questions coming. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.